All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. We'll probably start off a little bit slow to give people time to turn up and log in, but like to introduce myself, Josh Harle, the Director of Tactical Space Lab, and I'm here with the artist Tully Arnot, and he's going to be talking in conversation with us today.
Hello,
so
everyone.
Yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Probably
We're just going to be talking
through
through some of the ideas behind Tactical Space Lab projects
turn up
and things like that, and log
Yep.
in. But
Before we start, though,
like
I guess we just like
to,
to acknowledge
introduce
the
myself,
Gadigal people
Josh
of
Harle,
the Eora
the
Nation,
Director of Tactical
and pay our
Space
respects
Lab,
to elders
and
past,
I'm
present,
here with
and emerging. Thank you.
Awesome. So this is similar to a bunch of the live streams that we've done in the past. The difference being that we're streaming on YouTube, so there might be some technical issues that we need to sort of get hands on at some point. Hopefully, all of the sound is working as usual. If there's anything wrong, if there seems to be like the volumes of the microphone is too low, or you can't hear something that seems to be necessary, or things are cutting out, or the video isn't working quite the way that it should, just let us know in the comments. As well, this is going to be kind of informal, so like if you have any questions or anything at any point in the live stream, just stick something in the comments, and we've got them up at the moment so we can see them there, and we might not respond immediately, but we'll have a look and we'll go through and sort of acknowledge each bit of the comment as they go through and when we get a chance to go through it. So I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping around the live streams. So this is one of a bunch that we've been doing through the VR studio that we've been running. All of the rest of them will be accessible via the Facebook group and also the website. I'll just jump into the website information. So Tactical Space Lab has got all of the previous VR studio streams. That's just, the links are at the bottom of this video if you want to get any of the links to any of the things that we're looking at today. So all of the old videos are archived there. We'll stick this one there too. I'd like to acknowledge the funding and support of Australia Council and Create New South Wales, who've both helped support this project and made it possible. And I'd like to thank Ars Electronica for involving us in the program and giving us this platform to have a bit of a chat about what we've been doing. It's really nice to get the word out and to sort of get a little bit further exposure into the world via Ars Electronica. Cool. All right. So the reason why I've asked Tully to come along and have a bit of a chat is because he's an artist that we're working with at the moment on a really exciting project. And I thought that just as a way of going, we'd have a bit of a chat about that. We'd talk about the VR studios in general, and then we'd talk about the one that we're working on at the moment, which is with Jason Phu, who sadly can't be here tonight, but we'll have a chat about where that sits. And in talking about that program and Jason Phu's project, it will probably give a bit of illumination over the way that we work and the sort of technical stuff that we're doing as well. So let's go to Tully, do you want to chat about your involvement with Tactical Space Lab?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess we've known each other for quite a while now, maybe 8 or 10 years, and I followed what you've done with Tactical Space Lab from the collaboration with Joan Ross.
Mm-hmm.
When was that? 2017.
18, I think 2018 is when we did that one.
And that was for the Acme Mordant Family VR commission, which was a beautiful work. And funnily enough, I was awarded that commission in 2019, and I chose to work with you on that again. And so that's a really exciting project to work on, and I guess my first experience working with VR. And alongside that, though, I've been following all of your different VR projects, and I guess the current round of VR studios, which somewhat have coincided with the lockdowns and COVID, and that's been a big sort of Sunday night viewing for me, tuning into each of those.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's nice to hear. Yeah, it's been, I think we were actually the transition from openings to live streams made a lot of sense. You know, we'd have we're in the studio where we'd have the openings, and we've got a big space here where we can. It's quite a large play space and quite a sort of exhibition compatible, I suppose, space, considering that we're just like a small studio. So it wasn't terrible to have openings here. It was a nice vibe, quite a good environment. We'd project the thing on the back so the audience could see what was going on. But the live streams, you can just have all those conversations that you might have one-on-one to everyone. It's archived. Yeah. Everyone can be involved asking questions. You can show it off to what we do is like hook up their headset to the live stream, so you could have one person sort of demoing the experience and talk through what was going on at the same time. And I think openings are great social events, and they're really sort of nice to watch people experience the works. But the live streams have been really good for just talking through the concepts behind the work. And ideally what we can do as well is, especially in some of the later VR studios, make VR experiences that don't require necessarily a particular bit of kit. So for Jason Phu's one at the moment, the big bit of the focus of the project is that it's VR, but it's VR that works across a whole bunch of different platforms. So just kind of like, you can look at it on your phone, you can look at it on a headset if you've got one, you can look at it on the computer, whatever. It's good to hear that people were pretty desperate for social interaction at some points in those live streams. Yeah. So,
But I think as well, the way that the VR studio is focused on, I guess, artists who are using VR for the first time, and being able to see behind the scenes or be able to hear a bit more of the creative process in which, you're working with sculptors, video artists, painters, like all different people, and the way that they approach the technology, I think is a very interesting way to learn about it and see how they're approaching it differently.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I mean, what I would say, if I had to have an elevator pitch for what Tactical Space Lab is trying to do, is to there's two things. There's demythologizing VR, so just trying to work against the idea that VR is some arcane magic thing that's like wildly difficult to get involved in. And then the other bit is sort of in parallel, just trying to work with different people with different perspectives and different ways of thinking about representation, or about how to create stories, if you want to talk in that sort of language. I think artists are actually like much more savvy and focused and aware of the consequences of different ways of representing things. So, one thing that's really good to have is you have a technology that people are rocking up to, and it's quite a weird framed experience where you put this thing on your head. And rather than just going, okay, like, well, let's ignore all of that extra stuff, blah, 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 and just the experience that we're working on is the thing that you see kind of through the horse baffles, that is the experience. I think it's natural for people from an art background to think about every single point that comes along to that whole process. Like, what is the space that you're in when you're introduced to this thing? What is all the conversation around VR? What does the actual equipment look like? All of that stuff as being part of the work and part of what you're working with the medium.
I think, as an example of that, would you say in Joan Ross's work? And that was, I was right in this room when I first experienced that. It was great to have a playthrough, and there's a part within that VR experience where you pick up a Polaroid camera and take a photo of yourself. And then when you come out of the VR experience, you handed me the photo that I had taken in VR. And that slippage between a virtual reality and physical, tangible reality that you hold in your hands was, I guess, to me, that really breaks down the barriers, and it's really thinking about how something that is a screen-based medium can extend beyond that. And I think that was a really beautiful element of that work. And artists working with VR, I guess, are maybe more open to how you can work with the medium, but sort of beyond that medium.
yeah, all sorts of things that you can plug in. I mean, that's maybe a good argument for part of the way that we work, and the reason why it's called Tactical Space Lab is because it's basically throwing things at the wall. It's like tactical as opposed to strategic, rather than having like huge amounts of, like enormous amounts of support and just working on these enormous projects. The idea is to have an element of experimentality and to do lots of proof of concepts and to focus sort of on the ideas. And me with a technical background and quite a sort of hacky sort of, throw things together and make them work kind of background. It was it's a cute idea that a virtual camera produces a physical outcome. And it's one that technically was quite straightforward to implement, but just kind of we needed to be in a place where that's where we'd throw things at the wall and experiment and try something and see what it looked like. And more than just sort of that, there was that slippage that went on, and there are all sorts of interesting things as well, thinking about it's almost like proof of the dream, the photos that come out of it. And weird things were happening, like people, you were sort of embodying a particular character in that experience. And you, like, often people would take selfies. And if people would identify in a really weird way, that hold the photo, which already is quite an interesting thing, because it is like waking up from a dream and then having some artifact that's there sort of pulling it. There's a weird sort of connection to memory and intangibility and things like that go on. But also it was interesting seeing how people related to the character, and people would have the picture, the selfie, and they would identify with this. Everyone's photo was exactly the same. It was the same character, and everyone would be like, oh, this is me doing thing. And it was a really interesting sort of mechanism for getting an idea of people's embodied sort of connection to that character. I suppose I can quickly bring up the aesthetics of that were quite interesting as well. Jane Acme. Let me find it first before I sort of throw everything at the wall. That one will be. That's a good image from it. Okay, so we just got a video documentation of it that sort of shows quite a good indication. I'll turn the sound off. And there we go. So we created this sort of very much in the style of Joan's collage practice. This world where you'd go, hopefully this isn't a spoiler for the experience, but where you'd go and have all these things to interact with. It was good fun.
And I think what is really interesting about this work compared to other VR artworks that I've seen is the interactivity. And a lot of VR is really just immersive film. But this is, it shows your background in gaming and your approach that is about how the user interacts with that environment rather than being a sort of passive viewer in a cinematic experience.
Well, I mean, that's another thing to talk about VR. What is driving VR? Is it there's a bunch of people from the film industry who are driving a particular type of VR, and there's a bunch of people from the games industry. I'd like to think, like, obviously, like, I play a lot of games, and the forms of first-person storytelling, if you're going to talk about what VR can do, one of the things it can do, which is maybe much more humble than the sort of language that people use around VR, is give a wider group of people access to some really interesting forms of storytelling that you have in games. But, unless you know how to use the keyboard and the mouse, and you sort of habituated that way of interacting through a space from that first person perspective, it's going to be immediately inaccessible to you. Whereas with VR, you stick it on and you can tell the stories in the same using the same sort of interesting mechanisms. but without needing people to have like how many years, 30 years of first-person shooter experience, for example.
But I guess like that example of the first-person shooter is maybe a gaming experience that a lot of users might be used to, or like of all the different video game experiences. Yep. You know, most people have been in a thing where you're shooting at stuff and you never know if there's someone behind you who might shoot you in the back of the head and then the game's over. And I guess that's something that I've found with other VR artworks where, you know, it is 360. You can look in any direction, but often there's one plane that you're looking at. It's still, you know, it may as well be traditional cinema.
Yeah.
Because there's not this awareness of everything around you. There's one focal point, which is really interesting, and then everything around you is dead space.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine it being like if you're coming from that traditional filmmaking background where and we can talk about a difference between sort of emergent and focused or linear storytelling as well, because that kind of comes into it. But you can imagine that the filmmaker wants to still drive your focus around the environment to particular points of interest. And there's things that you can do, creating sound and motion, that will drive people's view. But it's kind of, you know, it's the conceit to it is that you're supposed to be choosing to do that. And it's supposed to be natural, but they're taking control over it and just sort of basically putting you in the scene without any good reason to do it, other than that it's a novelty. Should we, where should we go from here? So I suppose there were a few really interesting experiments that we did. Like Jones was really nice because in making that work, we kind of subverted the medium itself. So we were playing with the audience expectation of VR as this playground where you could just grab things and so we didn't have to, it was kind of cheeky, we didn't have to say yes, we were totally you know, hard charges for VR, for the value of VR. We could use the VR and use the set of expectations for VR to make a work that only worked with that set of expectations. And then so for Tully's commission, I think it's interesting in another way. It's sort of it's doing taking the sort of standard way of doing VR, which is sort of like, here's a novel thing and like it's got all the bells and whistles, and just by the fact that it's VR, it's going to be amazing. And not being artists rather than designers, I suppose, not taking the medium as at face value, and deciding for yourself what you think is important about that technology, and sort of twisting the usual sort of way of working with it.
Yeah. Well, I guess with the work we're developing, that's gone in a couple of different directions from the original sort of VR idea that we were working with. And partly that is, you know, very shortly the work is looking at human-plant interactions or communications, and then maybe sort of decentering the human form of perception and trying to look at, you know, some sort of understanding of a post-human idea of experience. And so fundamentally, you know, like the mammalian perception is visual, and how we can try and perceive in a way that's maybe a bit more phytomorphic, a bit more plant-based. But then the irony of that is we're using a visual, like incredibly visual medium of two screens strapped to your eyeballs,
with all of the, you know, built specifically for taking advantage of our range finding stereoscopic vision. But
then you know, once you familiarize yourself with the headset and the way that you can interact with that, you realize the strength of that machine for audio and for very immersive three-dimensional spaces that you can construct with sound. And so when I first experimented with that, just in Unity, dropping in a bunch of found sound effects, and as a user, and it's not very often that you can sort of understand the user or audience perspective of your own artwork. But as an audience member going through this sort of test mock-up world, I was crawling around on the ground digging for this, you know, this stream sound that I had accidentally placed below the surface, and the way that you can create a soundscape that's not possible in real life, having, you know, a sound taking up, you know, a perfect little sphere that doesn't bleed outside of that space, so that when you're moving your head, absolutely physically impossible. And so you can enter that, and you can enter it with one ear and then pop your head out, and that use of sound and, you know, non-visual perception is a really fantastic element of the medium, which I think, you know, is ignored because of how beautiful visually it is. And then I guess for me, as someone that works with nature quite a lot, I guess, you know, like the sublime beauty of nature is something that I don't want to lean on too much, because there's no way that art can really compete with actual natural environments.
Well, not literally, anyway. And that's it. I mean, you say you can do some beautiful things, beautiful visual things in VR, but you know, if you're trying to do photorealistic, you're going to fall short. There's always a point where if you're not trying to own your choices, your stylistic choices, if you're trying to convince yourself that there aren't stylistic choices, then you're just going to shoot yourself in the foot, because it's going to fall short very quickly. And I love these conversations around sort of VR being so much, I mean, even VR experiences which are specifically about the experience of the soundscape, commercial experiences, have to fall back on some visual. And we live in a, you know, this is oculocentrism, the privileging of vision over anything else. All of this information which is presented visually, the image is such a privileged thing in the communication, or communication is probably not the right word, but in the presentation of ways of understanding the world. But you know, if you cut back all of that visual stuff, you don't fall short. You can make something that's like you know, if you liked BBC radio plays, you're relying on the audience's imagination to fill in without getting to a point where it's actually sabotaged by your attempt at a literal representation of something. It's like maybe it takes a lot more work, but we're good at doing that work. We're good at imaginative processes. You can tell a story. You can make up a story off the cuff, and people will invest and start using their imagination in that process of that story. We are getting through the time. I wonder, so we've already talked a little bit about some of the other VR studio programs. So the first program was in 2018. We worked with Joan Rust. She was the first artist that I worked with Alex Seaton, who's a sculptor, John A. Douglas, who does these very sort of large-scale cinematographic installation works with body performance as well, and also Jason Wing. And that was all like quite a nice opportunity to do different experiments in the projects that we were working on. All of that again is visible through the VR Studio website, so you can see the results of that in the 2018 program. For this year and this bulk of studios 2020, there's a bunch of different videos. The live streams that we've already done are on the Ars Electronica page, Fertile Methodologies. So you can link through to these and see the videos of us presenting the different projects. The other way that you can look at them is we actually have a VR hub space that is sort of presenting them in the hub's context. So this link is both through our main project page or at the bottom of this video. If you just go to quick join, you can jump into a VR version of our space, just presenting the different projects. It's kind of cute. Mozilla Hubs is kind of like trying to build a building using a Fisher-Price toy hammer. It's a little bit of a nightmare in some ways. Obviously, the benefit is that it's massively sort of cross-platform compatible, so all sorts of people can sort of jump into it. So here's our little space that we've got. Representations, just little sort of totems or elements of the different projects have been pulled out and represented here. And there's the live stream videos that you can click through. Some of them have a little bit of a warm-up time, so you might have to wait for us to sort of connect, and you can just move 30 seconds forward and see how that goes if you jump into it. I don't know. So them being live streams, there's a little bit of time of us sort of setting up and getting everything. So all of that's there. And then there's also information via the Tactical Space Lab website. And yeah, all of these, I guess what might be useful is for me to quickly go through this and just talk about these different projects. So working with Louise Zhang, who has a sculptural practice. She uses some really interesting sort of chemical processes for building these resin sculptures. She's also a painter. And what we were doing was bringing these into Houdini and sort of making them simulate and making them move, making them do weird things, using all of the sort of generative power of Houdini, which is a VFX program that people use for making sort of fires and water and things like that in movies and adverts. Do you think this is as much of a... Okay.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
Should I interrupt with questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, introduce this next one. Sorry.
Oh, actually, talking of questions, are there any questions? No. So if you have any questions, we are watching the YouTube chat section. If you have anything, we've still got about half an hour. If you throw questions up into the chat section, then we can engage, and would look forward to fielding some of your queries about the different projects. Cool. So
yeah, well, I just wanted to sort of ask about this one. So the next one is Grace Kingston.
Yeah.
And this, was that your first one in this round?
Yes.
Because you had a real event.
Nick was the first one.
Okay.
No, Grace was the first one, and then Nick was the second. Yeah.
So Grace's was, I thought really interesting because what you did for that is you had a real exhibition of the artwork because it was at a time when we could do that, and it was out in the bush in, where was it, Centennial Park, and utilising the
studio demo.
For free.
Go for everything. This is a project. We're working with
You're actually able to
soundscapes that I recorded.
So that's some documentary images of it in space.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's so fascinating about those developments with VR technology. The way that you can be in a natural environment like that, interacting with, like you were touching real trees and logs that were in your VR space. And then that VR space was done through photogrammetry.
Yeah, so this, the tree that's visible here is a little sort of low poly cutout of the entire scene. But because I work a lot with photogrammetry, it was a sort of no-brainer as a way of building a model of the real space. And it was kind of fun. There, I think, was one or two examples that I'd seen. Someone had used their VR headset, the Oculus Quest, for making a sort of fake augmented reality view of their apartment. I think a designer had done that. And then I'd seen someone using the Oculus Quest in a park, so I sort of already knew that it would happily do its spatialization in open space. I think it was occasionally a little bit ropey because the trees overhead were moving around, which gave it not 100% robust, but it was just really nice opportunity to make an experience where the physical mapped onto the the represented space in that way, and doing all sorts of things that you can do with it.
Photogrammetry is something you've used for quite a while, and so I'm just quite interested in how that has transitioned from something that you use in sort of virtual representations to something that you're using in a more immersive VR environment.
Well, one bit of it, especially with the Quest, is that I've got better at the workflow. So it used to be you'd take it's fundamentally a pretty simple process. You take maybe 50, 100, 1,000 photos, and you get back a high detail model of the original space. It's a little bit, there's some, it's not perfect, but it's very, very powerful. Up until fairly recently, I wasn't so good at the workflows of that, so you get this thing, it's like 7 million polygons, and that's great, but you're kind of stuck with what you can then use that for. And just over the last few years, I've been getting better at those sort of game development sort of processes of retopologizing, so getting it and putting it into something that will be more portable and more usable. And it's a really good tool. I think probably more of that transition has been from sort of the reconstruction as a work in its own right, and then this one was sort of like using the technology as a tool for something else. Is kind of nice.
Yeah, I guess some of those reconstructions was that photogrammetry the pathways that you printed out? Yeah.
So well, kind of. It was photogrammetry. It was like a hand-built version for the planes. That was an old work. Wow.
But I guess just like the way that you've explored that mapping, or that sort of scanning of three-dimensional space and representing it as artworks, physical artworks, and then becoming more immersive virtual spaces.
I was interested as well with these projects of using the technology to talk about this sort of capture mentality of the technology. A bunch of my practice sort of earlier on was looking at different technologies for digital capture and sort of commenting on the motivation, or what a kind of human agency or human sort of set of drives that was the undercurrent of the use of the technology, rather than just taking it as given and saying, okay, well, this is a cool technology. So I had a little robot that drove around trying to reconstruct the space, and it was sort of a bit frantic and obsessive in its process of doing that. That was kind of fun.
I guess, this is a complete aside, but the use of photogrammetry in the last 6 to 7 months has kind of changed the way that it's been co-opted by real estate and things like that, where people are using photogrammetry to recreate properties for sale or for lease. And adapting to different restrictions due to COVID. But I feel like that's an interesting way that technology has evolved recently.
Well, it's so powerful that people are using it for as much as they can, for sure. And it's still, I've written about its use in archaeology, because the people who are using it don't necessarily fully appreciate what is at the heart of the set of algorithms and what its intention is. It doesn't really produce, it's not something that is about totally accurate representations. It's just about something that looks totally accurate, which is a reasonable distinction to make when you're talking about generating knowledge and presenting things. We're going to see much more of it, I think, in the world of VR and augmented reality, just because it's there and it's an opportunity to very easily sort of capture 3D models of things.
My head's always in front of the paddle.
Okay, well, I can place it there. So this is a little element from a work with Tarek Alip, who is both a sculptor and an architect, and that was working around sort of the symbolism behind certain architectural spaces. Tarek's got a really lovely practice of just so many elements of it are amazing. The materiality of some of his works in particular are really incredible. But it was nice to work with someone who was so interested in what space could do and say, and then work in VR where we could create these spaces that were doing some really interesting things. It just sort of pushing the environment in VR beyond just a space in which there are objects. This is the project that we'll talk about in a minute with Jason Phu, a little element from that. Kylie Banyard has, again, everyone, let's just say now that everyone has fantastic practices and they do incredible things. This was a project working in Mozilla hubs, and actually some of the politics or some of the sort of placement of Mozilla hubs as this sort of highly accessible, great sort of gift to the world resonated quite well with Kylie's practice exploring intentional communities, like 60s hippie communes and things like that. So we kind of rebuilt this commune space inspired by the Black Mountain College in VR, and it was like kind of nice double
and really
resonance
fun
of
working across sort of
set
very
of
tactile,
ways of thinking about being
methods
in the
of
world
making, and then
that was at
then
play in these
photographing,
intentional
documenting,
communities,
scanning, and
also
sending
happening
them to
in
Josh,
the
and watching
context
him then
of
put
VR,
them,
if that makes
I guess,
sense.
like
Yeah,
render
yeah.
them and turn them into
But that was
these.
quite nice, and also a little bit of an opportunity to work with during some of the sort of technical processes of getting things into Mozilla Hub. This is working with an artist who often does sort of very theatrical film-based works, John Gillies, and we work with Insta 360 or Insta Pro.
Insta 360 Evo.
Yeah. So it's a stereoscopic camera that you can sort of record in 180 in depth, and we sort of modified our video so that we had a 360 scene with stereo video. You can see that video through our little live stream for that. This one was really great. I'm going to play with the audio on, I think, a little moment of this. This is working with a musician who studies a lot of improv music. He's got a really good music back catalogue. He's got a few albums out, but he's currently working, sort of studying improv. And this project, I don't know if you can hear at this point. It's a bit hard to have a sense of how loud the sound is. But we made this space where it was sort of exploring that the generative elements of different musicians working together, and kind of this conflict between having too much order and too much chaos, sort of just that boundary where things are quite interesting. So I spent a long time having quite involved philosophical conversations, like why do humans exist? Why is the Earth here? Why is there enough order that there are planets and that there's life, but not enough chaos that we don't immediately get wiped out by the planets getting ripped to pieces? So this interesting question of like just skirting the boundary of enough chaos that things are interesting. So for this one, there's a little, it might be a little bit hard to see. Jump forward. We start talking. There's a little sort of constellation of points that's visible. But what we're going to do is maybe take it in turns. Nick's going to go through the projects that we worked on over the last few weeks. Just so 2 weeks ago, and sort of grab we finished it, and yeah, we're going to try and make this let go. There's a microphone on Nick's headset, so he can talk and answer questions and things. There's the microphone here. There's the sound on the headset, so I might tweak.
Assets that you kind of found somewhere, or
They,
do you design them?
most of them are just uploaded. Most of them are low poly assets that we sort of that were designed to be like normal animals, and then rigged them, so gave them skeletons and put them into different positions.
And how about those trees?
The trees. Okay. So this was another bit of the work, was trying to create a this sort of almost mandala-like hand-drawn sort of environment from it. So Nick and I had a mutual friend who was an artist with a really interesting practice, and this the background was sort of trying to respond to a particular style of drawing. She had.
Were they hand cut paper?
Yeah. So we
they were really nice.
yeah, we had basically making a mess, cutting out the little bits to try and make them sort of fold out, and then scan them and bring them in to kind of try and create that sort of sense of the paper, physical paper sort of space. And Claudia's was again a fantastic painter and installation artist, and this sort of transitioned quite a lot. There are particular characters in Claudia's paintings that we were trying to sort of recreate scenarios from the paintings in VR, but we went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, just sort of focusing on particular character studies to see how far we could push sort of things like the simulation of the clothes, effectively working with animated simulation of the clothes, and just having these 3 of the characters out of maybe 25, just really focusing on the design of the clothes with Claudia's hand painting style over the top, and getting John's project, the animation, and getting the cloth simulation, and just trying to see how far we could go along there. And these are basically the characters that we've just shown the sound of. And again, using Houdini just to get that sort of really nice look of the final renders and the cloth simulation and everything. That was a nice project. Just seeing what happens when you sort of try and say, here's some of the original paintings that we took the characters from.
And this one, similar to the last one, I think there's a really beautiful use for hand-painted source imagery, and I think all of them have that great sort of, the artist's hand is visible in a lot of them, rather than being, a more sterile, 3-dimensional environment.
Yeah, well, I mean, the goal is to explore how VR can be used to extend the practices rather than just like supersede it in digital. Yeah. So, I mean, Joan kindly allowed us to use her skybox from her project there. So, if you look through the windows, we can see some of the things that are I have to jump up. But so for Joan's, for example, her use of digital collage, we brought it in and experimented with how it would work in VR. It did work really well. For all of these, there's no point in working in VR and just, it seems like a brute sort of thing to do, to just ignore that set of the focus, and the aesthetic style is obviously very, very strongly connected with what the different artists are trying to say. And there's so much subtlety and mastery of that process of choosing different forms of representation. One thing that I'd love to point out is that for none of these experiments did we assume that it was going to work. So the very first one, Joan Ross, it would have actually been quite interesting to have got to the point where it didn't work, and then you get to have that conversation about why that transition. Why doesn't it work in VR? Because VR doesn't have even just saying, because the audience, the framed experience of an audience member putting on a bit of technology, and rather than experiencing the work itself, they're experiencing the novelty of wearing a bit of technology. That is a very strong and reasonable answer to why it didn't work.
Yeah. I guess that's like with my project, the Oculus Quest is great, but it's not as powerful as some of the corded VR headsets. But coming over here and going in different VR experiences with your other headsets, there's always a point where suddenly the cable is pulling at the back of your head when
Well,
you
let me get this thing.
reach the limit. And
The I mean the I don't even have the connection on it.
yeah.
The Oculus Quest. The Oculus Quest has about the same resolution as this thing that was only just like a couple of months beforehand, which is like the Vive Pro, which is like wearing a microwave with an antenna on the top of it on your head. It's like such an involved process.
Yeah.
You know that you're doing it. It feels like you're getting plugged into Lawnmower Man.
Yeah.
It's not an
And
experience.
the Quest feels like ski goggles or something. Like it's you still know you're wearing it, but it's easier to lose sense of that technology being on you.
Yeah, absolutely. And from there's, I mean, obviously it still has something with it. That experience of using it, it's got a sort of technology feel to it, but I think it's fairly innocuous versus some of the other things that you could be doing, like that sort of headset. Yes. How are we doing? How are we doing for so I suppose I'll spend a little bit of time now. We should talk about Jason's.
Yeah.
So Jason's is kind of fun. It's not meaning to sound patronizing. Jason's is very fun. It's a project that is both one of the VR studios, but we're also working on it through a City of Sydney fellowship. And the idea is, I'll just get it running with the caveat that this is sort of work in progress, testing, more testing technical elements than the final view of it. But what we are trying to do with it, that's where it doesn't, there we go. What we're trying to do with it is create an eternal parade. So we're trying to have a VR experience that just goes on without end. And the idea, I suppose, behind it was that in COVID, everyone's talking about how all the natural animals, the dolphins, are coming back to Venice, all of this sort of stuff. That since people aren't out on the streets, this set of mythological spirits is coming from the underworld and roaming around the streets just to fill in the gap where the people once were. The focus behind this project is accessibility. So it's going to be live streamed with a 360 stereo video on YouTube. So you can look at it on a mobile phone, you can look at it on an iPad, on a headset if you want to plug into it, on a desktop. It's generative, so it will just keep on going, and as you can see, there's sort of early tests of what's going on, but these different characters are sort of getting created in slightly different ways. There's these little banner texts that are being generated, but the main thing about it is that we're going to hold workshops and allow students, so we'll have like kids workshops where we'll generate new content and we can upload it, and then the content will appear in the characters, so people can design their own monsters. We upload them, they pop up into this eternal parade of characters. What else? Yeah, so just like trying to still in that sort of thing of the same type of technology as VR, I suppose, a very, very different way of delivering it to the VR headset. Although you can look at this through a VR headset, you can log onto your native YouTube app and look at it in 360 stereo. And I'm really looking forward to that sort of element of working with different. I've worked with kids before to make VR projects, and it's really good fun. And the idea of designing monsters. Jason Phu has got a big practice of doing kids workshops around creating monsters as well. All sorts of like painted cardboard boxes and things, really amazing outcomes from them. So I think it's going to be really good fun. Yes, and So yeah, don't know where to go from that.
Show me some more work. What about the other kids' workshops that you've done? Do you have documentation?
Yeah, I do. I will just. What I will do is find maybe some examples of Jason's workshops if I can, and also some examples of the workshops that I've done with the kids. You know, it's really fantastic because, again, that process of building things in VR fundamentally is like making a diorama out of a shoebox and some, cardboard toilet rolls. Yeah. It's not. The most important thing is that you are creative and that you bring your own interesting way of looking at the world to it. The technical skills, sometimes there's things that you try and do which it gets a little bit difficult if you have really ambitious sort of technical things that are absolutely fundamental to the idea. But most of the time, especially artists, are really good at sidestepping some potential limitations and thinking about different ways of doing things. And in opposition to huge studios that have been making films or making games for the last 20 years that are pushing into VR, and they just take the same ways of thinking, the same boring sort of franchise ways of thinking, and put it into VR without really doing anything interesting. It's wildly exciting to get kids to do this sort of stuff.
I think, in a sense, so since we started working together, which was, I guess, about a year ago that we started working on the Acme Commission, I didn't know how to make anything in VR, and parallel to working with you, started trying to teach myself a bit through tutorials, and that's been really great. But it's also maybe the more you sort of learn a technology, the more you're limited by your preliminary idea of what's possible.
I love that.
Whereas
that's a good point.
I feel like most of the people you've worked with in these projects, their practice is much less technology based. So if you talk to a painter and they have an idea of what they want to do in VR, then they're going to just see anything as possible rather than thinking that there might be limitations that you start thinking of once you start working with that technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, that's the problem that I have as well for myself, is that you will self-censor when you're thinking about ways of doing, like what is possible, what you can do. If you have an awareness of some sort of technical framework around how things work, then when you're having those ideas, you will just, even before you fully express them, you'll be like, oh, well, maybe it'll be easier if I shift it this way and make it sort of fit into that framework. Whereas my argument would be that artists working in VR or with any technology is beneficial to from the technical and the scientific side as well, because there is a wild lack of imagination in the process of developing technologies, which is evidenced through through unintentional biases, people just not imagining every part of the process of building a system and making assumptions about what the world is like, who will use the system, is an opportunity for someone to fall short because their worldview isn't very cosmopolitan. So you have the one that I find the funniest is that Apple iPhone that came out where it didn't work with left-handed people. And it's there's so many. There's ones that are less funny and more sort of dire, but not imagining someone who holds the phone with their left hand and the fact that they will short out the antenna by holding it with their left hand is a wild lack of imagination. Yeah. And the sort of co-opting and sort of kind of hacky approach to using these technologies that artists use is just fantastic. It's sort of creating a amazing ecology of new ways of thinking about using technologies that the designers didn't have any idea of. Yeah. So that's great. Let me go through these kids' things. And how are we doing? So these are just some postcards. I had the little printer out. It's not sponsored by Coke. Sorry, one of the kids decided that it would be fun to stick a Coke thing on it. So here what was going on was we did 2 workshops, one based on Joan Ross's VR studio and the other one based on John A. Douglas's studio. And part of all of the studios was the kids creating their own characters. So they'd have a little piece of paper with a net that they'd draw on, and we'd scan it, and it sort of folds into the different characters. So they could all design their own characters. For John A. Douglas's one, because for that studio we'd used photogrammetry to reconstruct some environments, what we were doing was using Play-Doh. So the kids would build these different shapes out of Play-Doh, and I'd go through the process of reconstructing it. And then I don't know if I have one with like a fully realized environment, but then we'd sort of build their Play-Doh city at 1:1 scale. So when you put your headset on, you were like that big, and you'd be able to sort of teleport around and move around this Play-Doh version of the city at full scale. And then the other one was Jane Ross's, sort of starting with an intro to her practice, and then just working to create lots of elements that we'd collage together to build these little spaces that were cute. It was nice to see. And what I've said before that's worthy of pointing out is that very exciting to do these workshops where the first VR experience that these kids have, probably not in the future necessarily, but for these ones, the first VR experience that they had was something that they'd made themselves. So it's just, very exciting. Cool. Well, we've got a bit of a dearth of questions, but if you, I think we.
Let me think of a question.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've done a reasonable job of talking about all the different projects so far, and all of the resources for the website for the different projects are at the bottom of the video. So if you just go down to the bottom of the comments, they're there. And if you liked this, all of our previous live streams are archived on the Tactical Space Lab website. We're on Facebook, you can follow us. And we've got next week, Jason Phu will be presenting that final live stream. And
on the 20th.
On the 20th, Sunday the 20th.
Australian Eastern Standard Time.
Same time as this one.
Yep.
Yep. And then at some point, Chidam Ayadamir, who's the last artist in the VR studios, who we don't have on the Ars Electronica program just because it comes a little bit later, will be having a live stream for that project as well. Great.
Cool. Well, that sounds like we're right on time.
Awesome. Well, okay. What do I need to do for my final things? I need to thank you for watching. Thank you, Tully, for joining me in conversation. You. And once again, cheers.
Thanks.